Hi, welcome. This is the second session of the Infrastructure and Nature webinar series. Today we're going to focus on enabling the sustainable infrastructure of our future. My name is Kate Newman. I'm Vice President for Sustainable Infrastructure at WWF in the United States. Last year, a group of individuals from over 20 organizations, ranging from NGOs to companies to multilateral development banks and research institutes, we all got together to co-host a week-long pavilion at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. And we chose to work on the fascinating topic of how the infrastructure of our future can be developed in harmony with nature for the good of our planet and for our well-being. One of the central themes of the Congress is economic and financial systems, supporting human livelihoods and economic development while sustaining nature and addressing the impacts of climate change. Infrastructure is at the foundation of economic development, and the private sector has a central role in generating the infrastructure we need. The pavilion is designed to explore how the private sector, civil society, government, and everyone can work together to reimagine how we both protect and support nature's engineering that continues to provide essential infrastructure services or nature-based solutions, and how we can develop the built infrastructure of our future to ensure a healthy planet and thriving communities tomorrow and for generations to come. So in spite of the delays brought about by the pandemic this year, critical decisions continue to be made. Deliberations are ongoing with global agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention. And then along with the World Conservation Congress, all of these are now going to take place in 2021. So our group decided to go ahead and start the discussions as we anticipate preparing for the Congress and hold virtual pavilions over the over the next 2 months. 6 sessions. This is the second of 6, and we're going to get started right now. And I'll start with introducing Ryan Bartlett. He's my colleague here at WWF US and organizer of this webinar series, and he'll be the moderator of the session today. Ryan's the Director for Climate Change Risk Management and Resilience at World Wildlife Fund. He coordinates with WWF stakeholders and our partners globally and locally, translating modeling science in support of policy development, local action and climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions, and resilient infrastructure development from around the world. He's a member of the GIZ Global Solutions Lab for Scaling Sustainable Infrastructure and has co-authored policy briefs for the Saudi Arabia T20 on nature-based solutions and integrated modeling for upstream infrastructure planning. He received his master's degree in environmental management from Duke University in 2010 and has been with us at WWF for 8 years. So Ryan, please take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Kate, and thank you to everyone joining us for this series of presentations and discussion. I know we've got a great audience from around the world, so it's a real privilege to be with you all today. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, just a couple of logistical reminders. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that we're asking you to use for questions that we will monitor throughout the presentations. There's also an upvote button there that you can use if there's a particular question that you want us to focus on in the panel discussion and the audience Q&A. So we'll have a couple of presentations and then a moderated discussion, and open it up to you all for any questions that you might have of our panelists. So without further ado, we have a great privilege today of welcoming both of the co-chairs from the open-ended working group on the post-2020 framework for the Convention on Biodiversity. Our first keynote speaker is Francis Ogwal. He is one of those co-chairs. He is from Uganda and has been working with the National Environment Management Agency, NEMA, since 2005. He's been active in the CBD for over 15 years, and since 2005 has taken on the roles as Uganda's Convention on Biodiversity focal point, vice president of the Convention on the Parties Bureau, the co-chair for Resource Mobilization and Financial Mechanisms Working Group, and the first chair of the subsidiary body on implementation of the SBI. He's also received a presidential award in recognition of his contribution in advancing biodiversity. So Francis, over to you and welcome.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Francis Ogwal is my name. I'll be making this presentation on the update on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at this very important webinar on infrastructure and nature. I'll be doing that on behalf of my co-chair, Basil Van Hav. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, just to give you a brief background about where we are with the current strategic plan before we actually see how we are incorporating that in the post-2020. As most of you may be aware, there has been a recent launch of the GBO5 that basically looked at the status of implementation of the IHE targets for the current strategic plan 2011-2020. And unfortunately, at the global level, the report clearly indicates that none of the 20 IHE targets of that strategic plan has been fully achieved. And only 6 of those targets are partially achieved. That is target 9, target 11, target 16, 17, 19, and 20. Now, the same report, the GBO5, also did analyze what has actually happened at the national level. And the information available also from that report is that although progress has been made at the national level, but is also at a level that is insufficient to actually achieve the IHE biodiversity targets. So bearing that in mind, we have set ourselves on this journey to develop a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, building on from the experiences and lessons learned from implementing the current strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this post-2020 global biodiversity framework is a framework that is being developed for all, whether you're in business, whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in banks, and therefore it makes sense that today we are presenting this framework to stakeholders who are in the infrastructure sector, because that is the other sector that actually is going to be a very important partner during the implementation of this framework. So it is clear that currently there is a very big loss of biodiversity which is being experienced in the last decade. The GBO5, as I told you, has indicated that we have not made any progress to halt that. But the good news is that there is a chance to really put things back on track. And therefore, we are hoping to come up with those goals for 2050 and the action targets for 2030 that can help us reverse that situation and put biodiversity back to a path to recovery. So we have got some overarching principles that we did use and continue to use as we develop this framework. And that is the following: that it is participatory, it is inclusive, it is gender responsive, it is transformative, comprehensive, catalytic, visible, knowledge-based, because this science has to inform this process. Above all, the process is transparent, it is efficient, result-oriented, iterative, and flexible. So overall, that is the framework for all, what we are thinking on how to come with it. The next slide, please. So what progress have we made to date in developing the framework? We have made quite a number of progress, as I'm going to highlight here. First, and the second meeting of the open-ended working group have been held. And that is the body that basically negotiates the text of this framework. So we have had 2 meetings of that body. Then arising from those meetings, from the first meeting, we prepared the 0 draft. And then after the second meeting, we prepared the updated 0 draft, which we recently had a virtual meeting and presented to stakeholders. Then also we participated in the UN Biodiversity Summit, which took place in September. And we had parties really, governments making pledge, very encouraging pledges to biodiversity. Now, after we have held the 24th meeting and the 3rd meeting of SBI, that is the 24th meeting of SABSTA and the 3rd meeting of SBI, we will then go ahead to draft our next version, which we are calling draft 1.0. So that draft 1.0, its preparations are awaiting these meetings to first be held. And after that, then we go ahead to prepare it. Next slide. Broadly, this is what we are trying to talk to focus this framework on. We are building on a very important vision, that is the Vision 2050, which was adopted already in 2010, that by 2050, all of us should be living in harmony with nature. The danger right now is that people think human beings are going to be on one side and nature is going to be the other side and then continue to exist on this planet. As we clearly see, we can only continue to live on this planet if we are going to live in harmony with nature. And therefore, we have got the 2050 goals and then the 2030 milestones. And there are 4 critical areas that this framework focuses on in terms of goals. We look at the aspect of ecosystems and species, genetic diversity, benefits sharing, human needs, how they're going to be met, and then the means of implementation. Having said that, the framework itself has got 3 areas, divided into 3 broad areas that we are focusing on. One is on reducing threats, the other one is on meeting needs of people, and then the tools and solutions that we need to use when you're implementing the framework. So once you've done that with the means of implementation in place, and every condition is in place, and then parties or stakeholders are taking their responsibility and are being transparent, you therefore assume that with those 2050 goals and the 2030 milestones, we should be making progress towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Next slide. So in terms of infrastructure, this Update Zero draft has 4 goals, but we've only picked goals that are important or relate to infrastructure. Goal A, this deals with the area, connectivity, integrity of natural ecosystems. And the thinking here is that by 2050, we should have increased that by at least 20%, and therefore be able to support a healthy and resilient population of all species while reducing the number of species that are threatened by maybe human action. And there is a certain percentage being mentioned there. SAPSA is yet to validate this, including 20%. And in general, we should be maintaining genetic diversity. So the key milestone here is that the area, connectivity, integrity of natural ecosystem is increased by at least, again in bracket, 5%. That is by 2030, that is a milestone we are thinking. And we hope that can facilitate increased conservation and recovery of species, as well as maintenance and or increase in genetic diversity. So that is the focus now, that by 2030, that is the milestone we shall have achieved. Now, goal B deals with the contribution of nature to meeting needs of people, that it is valued, it is maintained or enhanced through conservation and sustainable use, thereby supporting global development agenda for the benefit of people. And the milestone really clearly talks to what could be related to infrastructure. If you are going to do some kind of looking at how infrastructure is going to impact on the ecosystem, you need really to value the ecosystem. So the sector that deals with the infrastructure would be very much interested in knowing that nature is valued, and therefore we are able to know the ecosystem services that provide to the public and private sector, therefore should be able to make some disclosures on how they are going to tackle this aspect of ensuring that those vital ecosystem services are not necessarily destroyed, but could be enhanced. Next, please. So what are the targets now that relate to infrastructure development? Target 1, and which talks so clearly to infrastructure development, deals with the spatial planning, because infrastructure development mainly will deal with demand-driven delivery of services by populations globally. The population of the world is not increasing, is not decreasing, it's just increasing, and therefore the demand for services we expect will continue to rise. So proper planning is needed so that even the sector that is dealing with infrastructure can better be guided. So target 1 basically says that by 2030, at least 50%, again, SAPSA will validate that, of the land or sea areas are under spatial planning, that is globally. And we should be able to retain those areas that are intact as intact areas. So the wilderness areas where we think we should maintain them intact should remain intact. And therefore, you're talking about infrastructure ensuring some level of green development in a way, if they can at least ensure that for areas that are existing and intact, that maybe they avoid such areas and instead see where to relocate the infrastructure. But also that there will be restoration taking place. And again, the percentage is given there of degraded freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems. Target 11 deals with increasing benefits from biodiversity and green spaces, what you even may call blue spaces for human health and well-being. You will see that over the years to come, there will be a lot of migration of people to urban areas, but also meaning that there will be lots of infrastructure or houses being constructed in urban centers. But we need to be making way to make sure that such areas also have got green spaces so that people actually lead a healthier life there. So that is the target that deals with having green spaces in urban centers. And the thinking is that at least 100% of the urban dwellers by 2030 then will have such benefits. Target 13 deals with integrating biodiversity values into policies, regulations, planning, development processes, and surely here infrastructure comes in development. Poverty reduction strategies at all levels, ensuring that biodiversity values are maintained across all sectors. So this is the aspect of bringing in sustainable infrastructure, green infrastructure. Target 17 deals with the redirecting or repurposing some of the harmful subsidies in a way that it can be more useful for biodiversity conservation. And then target 18 deals with actually mobilizing resources from all sources. And therefore we see infrastructure playing a big role here as well. So this is it when it comes to the targets that relates to infrastructure development. Perhaps if there's a next slide for me to quickly finalize. So lastly, then looking at what came out of GBO5, what are some of the sustainable pathways that could still relate to infrastructure? One, that the cities and infrastructure transition needs to really be deploying more green infrastructure and making space for nature to thrive as well. So that is something that we could take on board. Secondly, as I said earlier, spatial planning needs to be taken on board to reduce negative impacts of urban expansion, especially roads and other infrastructure on biodiversity, including ecosystem and species. And lastly, we need to deploy nature-based solutions to really take on climate action that can help us still reduce or phase out the use of fossil fuels. So those are I think the key other sustainable pathways that relate to infrastructure as GBO5 recommends. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much, Francis. So that is the perfect introduction to the discussion today. Really sets really frames what we're going to dive into in more detail. So I don't need to tell everyone on this webinar today, but we are dealing with three major simultaneous crises. In climate change, we're seeing new extremes. We're seeing new extremes every week. You know, for us in the U.S., it's been the California forest fires that have been particularly stark, driven by new hot and dry extremes. There was a report that just came out from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, which showed just how many more disasters, 1.5 times more in the last 20 years compared to the 20-year period up to 2000. Double the losses to almost 3 trillion in that same 20-year period compared to the 20 years before that. In biodiversity losses, WWF's Living Planet report has shown that we've seen almost a 70% loss in the species that we've been monitoring since the 1970s. And then of course, we're dealing most pressingly with the COVID-19 pandemic, which unfortunately is becoming is becoming a huge health problem again as cases rise globally, but also devastating global economic impacts, and particularly in developing economies where we have the majority of people working in the informal sectors. The numbers are absolutely crazy, but I just saw yesterday that 1.6 billion workers globally are in the informal sector, and all of those people are now seeing real impacts on their livelihoods. So that is the context that we're dealing with here. It means that moving forward, as we consider investing billions and trillions of dollars in infrastructure, that we have to think differently. We have to be able to address all of these crises at the same time. We cannot lock in an unsustainable future. This is why so many governments were focused on green stimulus responses. But that's part of why we're here today, is to talk about beyond individual project level sustainability efforts, which are super important. We also need to think broader than that at that spatial planning scale, that land use planning scale that Francis so perfectly highlighted in his introductory remarks. The only other point I will make here is that there are a lot of unaccounted for costs, in not doing this type of planning, and huge benefits to actually tackling this type of integrated planning that holistically is addressing climate change, biodiversity, and economic inequality issues. For example, an IDB study of 200 projects going back 40 years found that 80% of them had been impacted by social, environmental, or governance challenges, resulting in conflict, and largely due to deficient planning alongside other issues. There are 40% savings by one estimate from the World Bank in meeting the SDGs with integrated planning as opposed to not integrated planning. And then of course, we've also seen a lot of studies that are showing the enormous returns and benefits of investing in climate resilience, with four times the return for every dollar invested. So that's just to frame the discussion here today. We're going to jump right into it with a presentation, a recorded video presentation from colleagues in Costa Rica. We have Ivan Delgado, who's the Vice Director for the Director of Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment and Energy in the government of Costa Rica. He has more than 15 years of experience in the creation of climate public policies. He was the founder of the Costa Rican Climate Change Directorate and its Carbon Neutrality Project. He's been a negotiator at the Conference of the Parties. And he coordinates the area of adaptation risk management for his ministry. His colleague Vladimir Naranjo comes from the Federal College of Engineers and Architects in Costa Rica, is a civil engineer with extensive experience in inspection and quality control of large-scale infrastructure, and is managing this project on infrastructure vulnerability analysis and risk management for climate change. So we're going to go ahead and go to this recorded video now.
Good morning. On behalf from Ivan Delgado from Climate Change Directorate, and from myself, Vladimir Naranjo from National Organization of Engineering and Architecture of Costa Rica, we are pleased to share with you our experience here in Costa Rica about the creation of a presidential decree that helps to generate resilience using climate services for infrastructure investment, and how it links with the tropicalization of a climate risk assessment methodology. Next, please. Here is the presentation content. We will briefly talk about our CSI group. We will also talk about the presidential decree, its political framework, and how does it link with climate services for a better making decision process. And finally, we will share some important information about the tropicalization process of a Canadian risk assessment methodology. Next. About our CSI group, I would like to use this phrase to describe our team, and I will read it. Individual commitment to a group effort, that is what makes a team work, a company work, a society work, a civilization work. And that's what we have here. We have a multidisciplinary and multi-sector work group, but it is I have to say that this is a very friendly group. We have people from Ministry of Environment, people from Ministry of Civil Works and Transports. We also have climatologists, engineers, bridge experts, hydrology experts, and so on. But mainly we have a group of people that enjoy working together for a common goal. Regarding the participation of GIZ in our group, I would like to say, and I want to say that they have helped us to in a proactive way to share experiences between different countries. And this is very important for us. This process of sharing experiences is very rich, and not only for receiving feedback about our teamwork, but also to learn from other experiences. And that is my personal opinion of that. Next, please. Regarding the presidential decree, the first thing is that in the process, it is in the process of being officialized. The executive decree is number 42,465, and it's called General Guidelines to Incorporate Resilience Measures in Public Infrastructure. And this decree has quite a story. The decree was created through a specific request from our General Controller institution to some specific government institutions. Around December 2017, this general institution wrote a report which evidences increasing of vulnerability in human and natural systems. And mainly it was because of loss and damage in public infrastructure due to extreme climate events. So a very important thing is that the report also has evidence about the reconstruction of vulnerability during the recovery process after the extreme events. So in December 2018, the General Constitution asked for the decree, and now it is almost official. Next, please. The decree has 3 chapters, and I would like to use this image in the right side of the slide because a strong foundation for a strong growth is the phrase that describes the decree. The chapter number 1 about generalities, the main objective is to provide guidance for multi-hazard and climate change risk assessment for decision-making processes. But something that is very important to say, and I would like to is that the decree is not only looking for to guarantee resilience to the society. The decree is promoting, for the first time, the nature-based solutions as one of the best options to generate the adaptation and resilience. And this is very important because this is the first time we have a political framework like that here in Costa Rica. And it would be very important also for our next generations. Chapter number 2 mentions the obligation for institutions for applying risk assessment methodologies. And it has also some of the general aspects around the risk assessment, like the incorporation of climate projections and some other important aspects. In chapter number 3 talks about the data access for assessment. And this is a very important issue because here in Costa Rica, we have some problems with data access because we don't have like web portals or something like that to download or access the information. And the thing is that we need the data information for climate risk assessment. So the chapter 3 is looking to open that for the people to use it that in the climate risk assessments. Next, please. About this topic of climate services, here in Costa Rica, we know that we don't have the availability and robustness for climate services as we have in many other countries because they're barely offered here. However, although we don't have that here, the truth is that I think we must begin with a first step, and if we want a better decision-making processes, if we want that infrastructure to be climate-proof. Next, please. And finally, even when I will not go into details because of the time, I want to share some bullet points around the tropicalization of the Canadian methodology for risk assessment. It is called 5BC protocol. And our tropicalized version is in its development process now. And the first thing is that the risk assessment methodology will be based on 5BC because we want to take advantage of our experience and we'll keep the main core of the methodology. So including interactions between infrastructure and climate parameters, as we have in many methodologies around the world. We can also say that our experience into several 5BC applications have allowed us to improve the approach of some of these steps. So we will be applying those improvements in our tropicalized version. We will define some government institutions scope for the application according with infrastructure investment, because we believe that we must define boundaries for the amounts considering government institution criteria. Another issue that is that according with some government institutions, they consider the experiences in 5BC application in Costa Rica have been kind of expensive and prolonged. So we would like to look for an efficient and effective way to adapt, apply the methodology, and to use the resources in that way also. Because of that, we will have two versions of the methodology, a light version with around 4 to 6 weeks for application, mainly for pre-feasibility or scanning process, and a full version with 8 to 10 months for application. And finally, we will be developing a scale to define the robustness or the confidence level of certain information, because we think that the government institutions could be confident about the application results if we include that. On behalf of Ivan and myself, I just want to thank all the event staff and all the sponsors for the creation of this kind of activities to share professional experiences and keep learning from each other. Thank you.
Perfect. So that's a great example of an enabling condition or a policy instrument, a decree at the presidential level, and then actually a demonstration of the tools to achieve that degree. So it's a perfect mix of exactly those enabling conditions that we're talking about here. So, and we'll be joined by someone from GIZ later in the discussion that can speak more specifically to this Costa Rican example. Up next, we have Asha Singhal, who's the Executive Design Lead for Biomimicry Frontiers. She's a biomimic architect, researcher, and educator, specializing in nature-inspired designs, bridging the gap between the built and natural environments. Her vision with her work is to create pragmatic narratives of hope inspired by nature, empowering people with tangible actions toward creating a climate-positive future. She's worked internationally in making, conceptualizing, and realizing speculative designs into inspiring and restorative living built environments. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome, Asha.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Ryan. I'm Asha Singhal. I'm the Executive Design Lead at Biomimicry Frontiers. We're a sustainability consultancy focused on creating holistic, nature-inspired designs. I'd like to take this time today to share what biomimicry is, its need, and some of the work that we're doing. So let's just start with the definition of biomimicry. What is biomimicry? Well, it's a term originating from the Greek words bios, meaning life, and mimesis, meaning imitate. Simply put, it is innovation inspired by nature. It is the Velcro that is inspired by the birds. Let's just take a minute to think about this genius solution. Because these seeds need to be dispersed over long distances, but are too heavy to fly, nature has this ingenious solution for temporary attachment. This hooked structure was emulated to create Velcro that we are all familiar with. Biomimicry is also the cement that is inspired by the biomineralization process of corals, which we use CO2 not just as a pollutant, but as a building block. This inspired a cement that instead of emitting carbon, sequesters and stores it instead. So this already gives you an overview of the first two types of biomimicry. Biology can be emulated in three ways: forms like the hooks of Velcro, process like that of cement, and systems which emulate the deep interconnected relationships that exist in mature ecosystems like forests. This will be key for our discussion today. So now the question arises, why should we look to nature for inspiration? Well, for one, it has about 3.8 billion years of research experience within the laboratory conditions of planet Earth. Evolution has given us diverse, adapted, and resilient blueprints for sustainability, answering challenges for us such as color. How do we manufacture color without using harmful chemicals? Or sustainable packaging, what does that look like? How can we start creating thermal comfort without using any fossil fuels? Or how can we start using waste as a resource? There are millions of species out there who in the evolutionary timescale are our elders. They're out there ready to guide us in our endeavors and challenges. Biomimicry helps us in understanding that we can look to nature with more than just a utilitarian perspective. and shift our perspective from a warehouse, nature as a warehouse of raw materials, to a library of knowledge. And there is an urgent need to stop destroying that knowledge with our actions. Why should we look to nature for infrastructural challenges? Within our built environments, we have created a massive contrast between us and the rest of the natural world. The more we deepen that contrast with inputs of energy, the higher the risk and even certainty of collapse. This is something we're beginning to see within the multiple crises we are now facing. We are currently at a point in history where we are realizing the devastating impacts of our actions. The International Monetary Fund found that global damages due to storm events in urban areas have risen from 20 billion per year in 1990 to 100 billion per year in 2000, and now we're in 2020. Storm events are causing billions in property damages, followed by multiple other cascading impacts. The root cause of these costs stem directly from deeply disconnected built environments that do not manage storm events beyond a certain capacity. Natural design, on the other hand, can act as an effective buffer in these situations. For example, forest canopies are designed to dissipate wind and storm events, like a buffer to the underlayer. This allows the wind and the rain to be more manageable, reducing its forces and allowing for greater ease of infiltration into the permeable soils. At a global level, there is no greater impact we can have on mitigating climate change than on increasing intact ecosystems. A recent study found that natural solutions can provide over 1/3 of the cost-effective climate mitigation needed between now and 2030. Integrating nature can help reduce cascading impacts due to those local storm events by better on-site rain and wind management, while at the same time help reduce the global climate chaos. We increasingly need to start thinking about a systemic shift, both from the bottom up and from the top down, that can begin dissipating this contrast between us and the natural world. At Biomimicry Frontiers, all our work focuses on creating a world in harmony with nature, which means taking a holistic view towards planning and construction from the very beginning. To address the complexity of infrastructural challenges and the need for a holistic viewpoint, we use a diversity of frameworks and methodologies, including but not limited to systems thinking, biomimicry thinking, circular economy, life's principles. Some of the key points of consideration within our design process are finding the emergent trajectory of the land, which means conducting land assessment for place-based designs and including systems analysis within this. Finding the ecological assets that can be used and replicated, which means using ecological performance standards to leverage the benefits of the local ecology, working with the local ecology to find the most context-responsive designs. We learn from our local organisms how to adapt in place. This means asking our elders who have been there for a while, how do they solve these local climatic challenges? Creating design fiction scenarios to understand what this place would look like in 10, 20, or 50 years from now. And how do we want it to function then? This helps us have strategic foresight to bridge the gap between where we are now and where we would like to be, and take the necessary actions. Now, in practice, the strategic solutions can range from technological interventions to city-level planning. This includes building scale like residential development projects, neighborhood level like a circular food economy project that we currently have in Canada, and urban design projects, including various master planning projects and airport design. So I'd like to share some of these in detail, those that are especially relevant to today's topic. This one is a master planning project that we have in Vietnam. Here, our focus was specifically on how to adapt to place in a coastal region. Two key aspects of this design were to create the living story of place. So this was about learning how the natural hydrological flows in place occur, and leveraging that to support the environment and the ecosystem by building with it again instead of against it, which is the usual way going forward, which is the usual way how people go. This part of the process helps us in understanding how to create adaptive local landscape and infrastructure. Then the second point, which is really important, is the iterative building, which meant developing the land in phases. For each phase, we would leverage and incorporate impacts from the previous development into the next phase. It helps us integrate development with growth, which I feel is a key aspect. In another urban design project in Canada, we're specifically exploring the concept of interconnectedness, as seen in nature by way of dissipating gradients. By using land assessment strategies and ecological performance standards, we are working to create the highest ecological benefits for local residents, which includes both people and nature. Scenario analysis helps us showcase to the developers the comparative potential of the land when the focus is on long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. This also includes a cost-benefit analysis and a feasibility study for each scenario. Resilience is a function of time, which we need to honor within our built environments. Systems aren't born resilient. It starts with a plant, which is rather prone to slightest disruptions. Mature forests, on the other hand, take hundreds of years of interconnected, interlayered systems to develop resilience. We need foresight when designing our infrastructure and to begin planning for the long term. To wrap up, I'd just like to reiterate that we need a shift in our actions to prevent a system-wide collapse. We need planning approaches that are adaptive and allow for small-scale releases, and planning methods that take into account indigenous wisdom along with emergent technologies to pave way for more resilient systems. Thank you.
Fantastic. That was great. Thanks so much, Asha. Really, really excellent stuff. The design principles in particular, I really love. I think I need to quit my job and go back to landscape architecture school. Thank you so much. That's a perfect segue into our next presentation. And if you have any questions for Asha, please put them in the Q&A there. Our next presentation is from Professor Richard J. Weller. He's the chair of landscape architecture at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the Meyerson Chair of Urbanism and Chair of Landscape Architecture and Co-Executive Director of the McCard Center at the Weitzman School. In over 30 years of practice, he's worked simultaneously as an academic and a consultant, specializing in the formative stages of design and planning projects ranging across all scales. His most recent research concerns global flashpoints between biodiversity and urban growth, as documented in the web-based publication Atlas for the End of the World, which is excellent. Everyone should go check it out. And the Hotspot Cities project. His current work project is a feasibility study into the concept of a quote-unquote world park. Richard, over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today. The image on your screen, I'm going to go very fast because I've got a lot to try and organize into a coherent narrative, but I think it will be helpful. But I will move quickly. The image on your screen is an accurate image of the Earth. It is clearly not the blue marble, but it is an accurate image. What we've done with this image is strip away all of the land that is not protected. So all of these fragments that you see on this image of the world are the protected areas. Now, this is an extraordinary achievement that this territory has been amassed over the last 70 years by the IUCN and the NGOs and others. But we do have to ask what's also wrong with this image. And what's wrong with it is that the two key words from the CBD, that protected areas should be both representative and connected. The current state of the world's protected areas is really an ad hoc sort of archipelago of fragments. They're not representative of the world's 850 or so ecoregions, and neither are they connected. Now that's a problem because as the climate changes, species are effectively trapped in these fragmented protected areas. Now, currently we're at about 15.4% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is protected. Aichi Target 11, which the deadline is about to pass at the end of 2020, the target is for 17% protected area. I'll come back to that momentarily. Now, the reason why the protected areas are so fragmented and ad hoc is, of course, because we've been so fantastically good at building connectivity and a coherent global urban system. Now, this is an extraordinary evolutionary achievement. However, it's been at the expense of everything else. So while our infrastructure, our telecommunications is so incredibly well connected, it has sliced and diced the terrestrial ecology of the planet. To the point where, of course, as others have mentioned, this is effectively becoming suicidal. So unless there's a reconciliation between the landscape systems and landscape ecology at a planetary scale and the global urban system, we are in big trouble. I'll put those two worlds side by side for you. As I mentioned, Aichi target the conservation world on the left and the urbanized world on the right. The Aichi target for the 2020 deadline was that we would reach hopefully 17% terrestrial area protected. That has not been achieved, but the effort goes on, of course. And on the other hand, the future for urbanization is that there'll be at least another 3 billion people urbanized across the course of this century. Now, I'll just pictorialize this for you so you understand, because these are the two kind of this is the tension of the 21st century, how we reconcile landscape systems with urban systems. If we were to reach the 17% protected area target, you think, well, we're already at 15.4%. So another 1.6% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is not very much, right? But it is, in fact, it's close to 700,000 central parks. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that's a kind of a resource that we have in terms of trying to reach the CBD targets. On the other hand, the 3 billion people that I've spoken about who will be potentially urbanized this century amounts to 464 New York cities. Now, in order to meet that demand, we would have to construct 5.5 New York cities every year. That is what's happening. Urban growth is the historical driver of all of all of the change that is occurring. Now, as I said, these two worlds need to be reconciled in some way, and that's borne out by even the expression ecological urbanism. It puts together two opposites, ecosystems and urbanizations, things that have been held in contradistinction, such as conservation on the one hand and urbanization on the other, can no longer be separate. Similarly, green infrastructure suggests that the old school thinking about infrastructure has also changed. This is summed up by the expression landscape architecture, which, for those of you that don't know about the discipline, it is not gardening. It's about the reconciliation of urban systems and conservation systems at a planetary scale. In terms of today's discussion, we're really talking about infrastructure. I thought I would briefly sketch the paradigm shift that I think is taking place. The old paradigm for engineering was that things would be resistant. They're hard, they're vertical, fixed in time, functional, of course, centralized, standardized, as cheap as possible. And that's the kind of old school engineering. The new paradigm is clearly that things will not just be resistant, but they will be resilient. That involves a certain softness, horizontality. They have to be adaptive, multifunctional, decentralized, site-specific, not just cheap, but valuable in many terms. And there's a shift, therefore, from engineering to geoengineering. Now, this is not just a romantic utopian projection. Geoengineering has a slightly sinister dimension to it, because it's really what the human species is doing is hijacking the Earth system for its own benefits. And as climate change becomes more and more extreme, we will be pushed to more and more extreme interventions. So the research question I've been looking at is, well, where should these 700,000 central parks be if indeed we were to try and meet the Aichi targets? Well, my answer to that is the biological hotspots. There are 35 of them in the world, and you know what libraries are to culture, these landscapes marked here in the brown color are to the global ecosystem. It's in these landscapes where the genetic diversity and creativity of evolution is primarily stored. And also all of these endemic species are threatened in these landscapes. So my argument is that the conservation dollar should be channeled into these territories as a matter of priority. Now, we've conducted an audit of all of this land, and what you see here is a very simple summation of a lot of work that we've done. The areas in green have effectively met the 17% target. So they're doing okay according to the CBD, but all of the brownish red areas are not. So this sort of mapping helps us prioritize where our investments should take place and where planning really needs to pay attention. Now, the other aspect of this that we've studied quite carefully is what's happening in terms of the behaviour of cities in the world's biological hotspots. Now, the frightening thing about this map is that each yellow dot you see here represents a city by definition, UN definition, 300,000 people or more. Each yellow dot represents a city that is rapidly expanding and is forecast to continue expanding out to 2050. And that expansion is in direct conflict with endangered species and remnant habitat. So this is a calamity happening now in the most valuable landscapes on the planet. From a biological perspective, you have unmitigated, largely unplanned, uncontrolled urban sprawl directly up against remnant habitat. Now, the sprawl of cities is not a fait accompli. It is something, it's a cultural byproduct. It's something that we can design and plan and study and do something about. So my argument is that this can be mitigated through design intelligence. We've reduced it down to a sample set of just a select group of cities. Now, these red dots show you what I call the hotspot capitals. These are the fastest growing and biggest of the cities in the hotspots. So they're the cultural, political, economic drivers, and they draw down on the resources, obviously, of their regional landscapes. We've mapped them in considerable detail. You can't see it so clearly on the screen, but each of these cities here, wherever this is the full set of cities of our sample set. And every time you see red in these maps, that indicates the zone where there is imminent conflict between urban expansion and biodiversity. Now, this tends to happen in two ways. On the left, you see the city of Perth in Western Australia, which is in a hotspot. And on the right, you see the outskirts of Bogota in Colombia, which of course is in the most biodiverse nation on earth. These are two incredibly biodiverse places. The image on the left shows a centrally planned economy where there is a kind of planning system, but nonetheless, the city is sprawling and destroying there are species in that image there on the right. You can see heathland. There are species in there that we haven't even identified yet, and yet the city is just obliterating these landscapes. Now, on the right, you see what we call informal growth. And so you need different methods and different strategies to deal with these two types of urban growth. In the case of Perth, we did a lot of work here where we were trying to in short, we provided or developed a green structure plan for the entire city. Now, what that does is it locks in the forests, that the remnant habitat, protects the aquifers, and then stitches the ecosystem together with greenways. And you can see them threaded through all that white territory. Now, then I can say to the developers, okay, in the white areas, which have low ecological values, yes, you can develop. But as you do develop, you have to pay for the green structure. Now, the important thing here is that spatial planning gets in first and ahead of the development front. It's no good being retroactive. We have to get in first with landscape planning. Otherwise, that's the only way we can avoid the inherent violence of urban growth. In the case of Bogota, we've done a ton of work on Bogota, and you can see here the red on this is one of our maps that shows the growth of Bogota out to 2050, and the red areas indicate where urban growth will destroy remnant habitat. Now, the strategy here, you can see Bogota is the grey area on the marked outlined in red on this image. That's 9 to 10 million people. The area inside the zone with the dashed green line is the Sabana de Bogota, essentially the city's food bowl. Now, Bogota is slowly but surely pouring concrete on its wheaties. The city is hemmed in by the Rio Bogota, the river running through the middle of the map, and the mountains to the right. The city is starting to sprawl out into its food bowl. So again, this is something that is going to be incredibly destructive as the city rapidly expands unless we can get ahead of the development front and lock in ecological values. Use investment to repair the river, protect the wetlands, and you can see the green blobs on this map represent protected area. Again, they are fragmented. They need to be connected up into a coherent system. So what you see here is an image of Bogota in 2050 as per our planning, where the city has effectively doubled in size. Indeed it has, and we're not against development. The city needs to grow. But if you track my cursor, you can see that here's the river through the middle. This is the existing city. This is all proposed. So it's a significant development, a second airport here. But the ecological values are locked in with this green superstructure. This area in the middle protects all the wetlands and puts at the very center of the new city what we call the green heart of Bogota. This is about the size of 10 central parks. So this is a gigantic area, but it plants ecological values at the heart of a new city. And the new city grows, extends from the old city and wraps itself around that, but the ecological systems interpenetrate it. So you get a kind of weaving of these two systems together. Okay, I want to turn to connectivity in the little bit of time that I've got left.
Yeah, Richard, sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap this up quickly?
Okay, sure. This is an incredible map. It shows connectivity, major connectivity projects going on all over the world right now. And I think that's incredibly optimistic. I did want to show you some examples, but I'll have to move really, really quickly. This is the poster, the sort of pin-up image for connectivity in the Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon connectivity planning. The overpass is a nice image of infrastructure that is ecologically sensitive, but it's also quite traditional. I mean, on the one hand, it's really about fencing and funneling. A more sophisticated scenario might be something like this, where the landscape is full of sensors and animals and humans are merged together. The traffic can be slowed down. It could also be a lot cheaper. The next example I wanted to show you was the sand motor off the coast of Holland that uses the forces of the natural world to build itself. Sand is dumped on the coast to reinforce Holland against sea level rise, but then the natural forces of the ocean distribute that sand along the coast. It's also incredibly complicated in terms of its technology. This is not simple. I mean, these models have to be made to predict that movement. The Great Green Wall of Africa is also an important and instructive project. It started out as a big green line on a map, and we've learnt since that nothing works. We need top-down power and investment, but we need bottom-up strategies, micro strategies. China has a national plan, which is a fantastic thing. We can learn from that. Of course, that's a country with a very strong central government, but they've got a complete plan for the whole nation in terms of land use. And I will end there. We're working on something called the World Park. Unfortunately, I don't have time to take you through it, but it involves connectivity on a planetary scale built around 3 walking trails. It's a very interesting project, and perhaps another day I can take you through that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard and Asha and the Costa Rican team. So I feel like that was a great balance of different scales, closing there with Richard on a planetary scale, giving us some great large scale examples. Also really learning from Asha and how, this is a true business model in this type of approach, and really thinking differently about development models moving forward. We are joined now by discussants. So if you are joining us on the panel, it would be great if you could turn on your video. We have Basile van Haaf, who is the second co-chair, along with Francis, of the Convention on Biodiversity's open-ended working group for the post-2020 framework. He has more than 27 years of experience working in Canada's Environment Department and as the CBD focal point for Canada. He's the chair of the CITES Elephant Working Group, and he has been, the chair of the CITES Elephant Working Group and CBD discussions on Indigenous knowledge and repatriation. He was the co-chair of the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes Water Quality Board, and also a director at the Meteorological Service of Canada. So Basile, your perspective here will be excellent in combining the two climate and biodiversity worlds. We're also joined by Pasquale Capizzi, who's the climate and disaster resilience lead at ARUP in the UK. He's an urban planning professional specialized in climate resilience and sustainability for infrastructure in cities, with 18 years of experience in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and currently leads the climate resilience portfolio of the International Development Team at ARUP. And recently has worked on the climate resilient infrastructure guidance for the Green Climate Fund, and as well as some sustainable infrastructure work in collaboration with us at WWF. We're also joined by Benjamin Hodik, who's the lead of the GIZ Global Project Enhancing Climate Services for Infrastructure Investments, or CSI, funded by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment and Nuclear Safety. As a development and public policy expert, Benjamin has worked for 16 years as an advisor and project manager in African, Asian, and Latin American countries with a special focus on public service delivery, governance, and climate change. Apologies for the extremely rapid introductions there, but I wanted to try and make up some time here. We're a bit behind. We should still have plenty of time for great discussion here. So Basile, I'm going to turn it to you first, just to get your reaction to what you've seen today in the presentations, and particularly from the context of your work on the post-2020 framework. Francis gave us a great introduction. There's obviously some really strong hooks in that framework in terms of targets on land use planning. But how do we better manage these big trade-offs between big development needs and urbanization trends that we saw from Richard's presentation, and the obvious needs that we have in arresting these hugely negative biodiversity trends? And how can the GBF help us get there?
Good day to all of you, and thank you for having me. Can you hear me well? Okay, so the question you're asking us is really one of the central questions of the whole GBF, the Global Biodiversity Frameworks, is how do we balance a world that needs to develop people with very legitimate aspiration for socioeconomic development with our desire to have a thriving and forceful nature that feeds us, protects us, etc. So we're trying to find that balance in every aspect. And today your conference on infrastructure is focusing on that one aspect. Francis and I, when we prepared the presentation you saw this morning, we focused on a few things. I'm sure Francis spoke about that notion of land use planning. Presentation earlier spoke about the 30%, the 17%. There is a huge discussion around moving that to 30%, but really in the end, it is about 100%. It is about 100% where we live, where we produce foods, where we organize shelter, and where those cities are going to be growing. So I think this notion of having a conversation about planning and discussion is going to be very central. In fact, while there are people that are not in favor yet of the 30%, all those people in general are in favor of land use planning. That's a concept that most will understand. So that's one thing. The other message is around how do we set the structures, and that's where I'm going to need your help. Is going to be, Francis and I need your input in terms of what you need in the global biodiversity framework to have that appropriate balance between green and gray infrastructure. And my sense is that you may want to talk about resource mobilization and how we flow money and how we make those decisions. And then in particular, reflecting on the scale of product. I will talk about one of my experience in Canada. We had a very difficult time to having our infrastructure ministry accepting that green infrastructure could be useful and there should be money available for purchasing of land, creating green belts around cities, etc. And finally, common sense prevailed that was possible. And then we were quite happy with ourselves just to discover a few months after that their floor for project was built on a history of building large infrastructure. It was in amount of money, it was 10 times bigger than the biggest green infrastructure project. So it was a second piece of work. And I think we're going to need to realize that working on green infrastructure is not only useful, but it's done differently. And we're going to need to work with colleagues across governments, across local government authorities, etc., to make that happen. So really looking forward, appreciate the presentation, particularly from Asha and Richard, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basile. So that's a perfect segue to Pasquale, based on your expertise around some of the challenges in actually implementing nature-based solutions from the private sector. Basile talked about the needs for resource mobilization. One thing that we know is that there isn't as much money in quote-unquote upstream planning because it's often about public goods and not tailored to individual project revenues. So can you speak to a little bit of ground us in some of the challenges that you see at Arup in truly investing in a different approach?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me too. I can offer obviously one perspective to a very multifaceted problem here. The first part of it maybe is from the designer perspective. So the designers are the company I work with 16,000 between engineers, architects, planners, environmentalists, you name it, all over the world. So you do have not only the capacity, but you're very keen to receive a brief and tell the client, look, you can do this very differently. You have to do this very differently. You can work with nature, not against it. So for example, some time back, we worked on a China mega project on seawalls, where the brief was very, very traditional in terms of please build this for us, engineer it so that we can actually push the sea away. And we came back with an idea of saying, you don't need to do that. If you do it with nature, this is going to be your outcome in terms of climate change, resilience, but also in terms of restoring tourism, attracting people and making an economic case out of it. So you do have the capacity as designers to go back and swim upstream, which is the title of this very session. We also have the capacity to tell the client, actually, this is not what you need at all. You can change the terms of reference and brief entirely. So it happened to us in a master planning of a Caribbean island quite recently. That's not what you need. You need something entirely different. You need to rethink with nature, not against it, and change entirely to your. Sometimes they're successful and they say, we hadn't thought about this, we can do this. But the reality is that it does remain client-driven to a large extent. So in a way, you respond to a brief, you respond it actively, as I said, but you still have to respond to it. Secondly, I think whoever the professionals in this panel today will know that it's not a monolith of planners that have a very clear workflow. It's not a leads to B and then leads to C. In reality, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of trade-off. Yesterday, we were discussing with colleagues on the opportunity to propose green walls for a large project we're doing in a Latin American country now. And you had the fire expert pushing back and say there's no operational capacities to keep these green walls green. They will dry up with climate change, etc., and then it will become a fire hazard. The reality is that you have a lot of back and forth and interdisciplinary discussions in all this, and it's a trade-off in the end that you have. However, my message from the designer's perspective is that you do have both the capacity, and I can tell you for a fact that not only us as a company, but many others out there are keen and prepared to do that. So the question is really why this is not happening and it's not happening as fast enough. I think, again, it goes back to what's upstream. I think that I see 4 issues here in really delivering nature-based solutions at scale and working with nature at scale. First, let's face it, it's the times that is needed for nature to function and to function into a project. You can actually has a start, as an end. It's upstream, it's downstream, but in the end, it's got timelines and it's got an engineering needs in this. It does take time, which means you have an implication for the outlook on the return for investment for the lender and for the developer. Do you have enough lenders and developers that are progressive enough to say, okay, I will wait for my return for investment long enough? Do we have enough risk pricing capacity so that we put a price to the risk for nature, which is a very difficult thing to do, and that's maybe where natural capital accounting meet like usual and traditional risk pricing. And then you have a long evidence time lapse before you actually this comes to fruition. Even today, I'm actually not sure the work I've done in Myanmar or in Maputo for mangrove replantation, if it actually working or not. Now, this works very well when you're working with grants, but when you're working with loans and lending, and you've got a price tag attached to it that starts to grow with interest, and it's a very difficult thing to take on. So that, to me, is the first point, the time it takes. The second one, issue to me, is that we are very much tied up to this traditional issue of CapEx and OpEx, the money you invest into the project, which is in a gray infrastructure and hard infrastructure is finite. It will cost you that much, saved contingency, right? And then you'll have this money to operationalize it. Now in nature, this is slightly more difficult to do. You need the lenders, the developers to fall in and move away from CapEx and OpEx and talk about TOTEX or total value if you want. So also considering, and it's a very difficult to do, it's nice to say, all of us, I'm sure we're convinced about that, but you need to put a price and a value on resilience outcomes that you get out of it. You need to put a price and value on the natural capital, and I know you guys have done a great work about that. And you need to be able to quantify it on both your sovereign money, on the money you're borrowing, and possibly also on grants. That's also a very difficult thing to do. But we need to move away from CapEx, OpEx, and go to a total value.
Perfect.
The third challenge for me, and I'm almost done,
Okay, thanks.
is objectively a challenge all this. You got a multi-layer authority, especially in a large infrastructure. So you got a port authority, you got your regional authority, you got the district, you got the presidents, you got everything in a city of coastal Africa. We've painstakingly managed to get a municipal council to sign off protecting a large buffer against sea level rise, only for the Department of Infrastructure to run a highway just on that, because there's basically no connection. Finally, and this is really last point for me, is the fourth point is you do not have as today the capacity or the willingness to do real upstream planning, which means move away from sector needs and a series of projects, but coming on what really makes sense on for the country or for places. To me, you really need a paradigm shift. It's not yet there, and I think it must be forced. So I really salute the work that Costa Rica is doing. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pasquale. I really appreciate that. Asha, I'm curious, I saw some head nodding there in response to Pasquale. I'm curious about biomimicry's confronting these similar challenges, or if you guys see it the same way. You brought up ecological performance standards in your presentation, which is something that you guys use. It's something that we talk about a lot in the nature-based solutions world. How can we, exactly as Pasquale said, actually quantify what nature can give us? Can you speak a little bit more to how that works in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these were some really good points that Pasquale brought up, and I was just thinking about them, like the point about putting a price and value on resilience and natural capital. That is definitely a barrier that we come across every now and again. Because when we're working with landowners and developers, like with landowners, it's easier because usually those projects are slightly smaller. But when we're working with lenders and developers, then it can be like any scale. And convincing them of why they should be investing in these long-term strategies can be quite interesting, for sure. Within biomimicry, of course, like there are other challenges that we face as well. One of them is also that within the public sector, there is an immense focus on growth, and this is especially relevant for the developing nations. And but often what happens is they're not integrating development in there. So one of the biological principles that we look towards is called integrating development with growth, which is, you know, as a child grows in height, they also develop mentally. And how does that look when we think about infrastructure? So we start building accommodation and houses before we even think about the roads that are going, are they ready for the capacity? This is something that starts leading to gridlocks, for example. So this is, I would say, one point which is very important, and we need to start thinking about within our policies and planning, which is quite crucial. Another thing that this brings to mind, because a lot of the discussions today are also like in some way or the other addressing short-term and long-term thinking, especially when it comes to return on investments, for example. But that also brings to mind indigenous wisdom. So within the indigenous cultures, there is this thing about thinking about the next 7 generations. And I think it is important for us to be able to adopt a 7-generation mindset in which we can start making decisions that do support more life and over the longer time frame, like the policies that we make, the infrastructure that we build, for us to think about 50 to 100 years in the future. Is it going to be still usable? How do we adapt? How do we design for adaptability and evolution of those structures? How do we design for flexibility so that once the use changes, and this is probably relevant to COVID as well, because here suddenly the use of every infrastructure is changed immensely. We're all working from home, and the offices that we used to go to are not relevant anymore. And they might be useful for something else, but this is a disruption that we didn't think about. So when we design for resiliency, we need to have a variation, some decentralization and redundancy within our infrastructure. So how can we build for it? So how can we embody resiliency within our infrastructures from the very beginning? And yeah, coming back to the indigenous mindset, I think one thing that is super important for us is to be able to release ideas, behaviors, and technologies that are no longer relevant, and be able to let go. And I think that can be super hard within the traditional mindset that we sometimes have. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of part of the paradigm shift and needs that Pasquale was talking about as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Asha. That's such a good point.
You're muted, Ryan.
Sorry, I muted myself right before I started talking. Benjamin, so coming to this point that Pasquale raised around how everything has to be client-based, you have an interesting example in Costa Rica of where government is playing a really central role in actually creating the enabling conditions. In other words, there's a decree, there's a policy that's making something different happen. Can you talk to us about how that worked, or what incentives were most important for getting government on board to actually take this approach?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. Maybe first of all, I have to say that I'm just here on behalf of my colleagues and partners from Costa Rica. So Vladimir and Ivan, they couldn't make it. And there was another question in the Q&A box. How is this CSI project related to this group and also to this presidential decree? So the CSI project is on behalf of the German government and the Ministry for the Environment and Nuclear Safety, working together with a number of organizations in Costa Rica, mainly the Ministry for the Environment and the Directorate for Climate Change. And we have been supporting the ministry in also partly drafting the National Adaptation Policy in 2018 with the focus on climate proofing. And we have worked on a pilot case that has included climate services from the Met Service or Met Office in Costa Rica to do a risk assessment, a climate risk assessment for a bridge in Costa Rica. In that process, various stakeholders were involved, and not only engineers and climatologists and sectoral ministries, but also the audit office or the controller of the country. So there was quite this initiative from different government institutions, the audit office in Costa Rica, but I can also say in other countries, the ministries for planning and investment or finance ministries, they have a big incentive, and they put an eye on the whole issue of loss and damage. And for them, I think one driver is, of course, the costs and the fear of losing infrastructure, not only now, but certainly in the future. And that fear is related, of course, to losing development gains over the last years and decades. But of course, that is only one driver. It's a fundamental driver. But the interesting part here is, and that's where we have started to create and build alliances between various sectors and institutions, is that the National Adaptation Plan and Policy is owned more or less as a process by the Ministry for the Environment. And in other countries, there's also now fundamental inputs into environmental protection laws that goes into adaptation and climate proofing of infrastructure. And that opens some doors also for these ministries to set the agenda and paradigm shift. I guess you can call it maybe paradigm shift, but it's an interesting point in time where the Ministry for the Environment is together with sector ministries and those that have the money at the same table, and can also put questions like nature-based solutions, eco-based adaptation into the play. And that is a very important aspect at the moment. And I mean, I can also say a country like Costa Rica is well known for its awareness towards biodiversity. It's part of their gene code, I guess. So it's a forerunner country in this regard. Yep. But I think it's important to say it's the coalition building. And in the end, I also want to say this upstream planning approach is driven also by or supported by this project, because we are looking into the question of climate risks. And before you come to any adaptation solutions, it is important to know about your risks, to avoid regret maladaptation, and then open the way forward to integrate nature-based solutions and other biodiversity solutions. And I guess people in Costa Rica are just very open to that now.
Perfect. Yep, exactly. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Really appreciate that additional perspective. I'm going to turn to bringing in some of the audience Q&A, and I think, Richard, this is a perfect question for you, and maybe Basile, you can also speak to it. So the concept of connectivity in terms of benefits to humans and in terms of benefits to biodiversity may conflict. I think, Richard, you made that very, very clear with those first two maps that you showed us, and you also showed us some examples. But the question is, how do you reconcile this? And are there examples of how the two approaches can coexist? You talked about your World Park as one of them, and some of the examples from Perth and Colombia, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more. For example, in the Perth or Colombia cases, in the Colombia example, did those involve large spatial plans that were endorsed by multiple stakeholders and government and the right people to actually enable this type of better approach?
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I think you have to have some faith in planning, and I guess my view is that all of the nations that are party to the CBD are expected to produce spatial plans, but they typically don't. I mean, governments don't like committing to lines on maps, and so we have a plethora of wordy reports full of jargon, and we don't have many actual plans. But I do have faith that if you allow the planners and the designers to do their work, you can move towards reconciling the tension between development, economic growth and infrastructure, and landscape values and landscape ecology. And I don't think I think generally speaking, the argument has been won, and we know how to do it. We understand how landscape systems work. We understand how cities work. So my answer is that if you plan carefully, you can set aside land for connectivity, and you can still grow cities. We're speaking very generally. I think Pasquale's points about the complexity and messiness of the world are very well taken. Anyone that's worked on real projects knows that it's infinitely complex, and it's all about trade-offs and negotiations and educating the client and so on. And I thoroughly agree with that. But I don't think the argument for landscape values is hard to prosecute. I think most people can get that. But you do need the creativity of the designers and the planners to show spatially how it can be achieved.
Great. So coming to the next question, I think it follows on this immediately is, so there's obviously a ton of value that we're talking about in this upstream planning approach, but the question is, who should pay for it? We keep coming back to this. I've come back to this a lot in my work. Everybody always says there's no money to do these things. So I'm curious, Basile, coming back to what your point earlier about resource mobilization is, where do we find the funding to support a planning process that has multiple beneficiaries? It's not tied to the revenues of a single investment.
So definitely the tools and the way that we're going to flow money is going to be very different in the future. The situation was changed dramatically a few months ago, and we're now seeing massive amount of public resources going into recovery plan, which means that the availability of resources from government will be limited. What we equally see is the value of counterproductive or not productive incentives and subsidies is about 10 times larger than what we need for biodiversity. So, and the obvious is that if you flow the money to the right place, then you have a solution. That's not easy. That's a lot more difficult than just writing a check and bugging a treasury official to get that check. But I do see some movements. There is a number of initiatives that I think people are realizing. And I want to come back to some of what was said earlier. I think if we set up the planning framework the right way, long-term focus, just beyond 4 years, going to 50 years and beyond, and we can learn from China on that. And the second point is to get away from that notion that man and nature are two separate entities that shall never connect. That's a very Western ways, and I was hearing Asha talking about indigenous ways of looking at things, and we got to learn from that. And we know that we're going to need to create landscape where there are people are able to live, and there is kind of a sustainable, productive ecosystem as well. And that goes all the way in the center. And as such, those urban parks are very, very important as well. So their percentage of not every hectare is the same. And then going back to your question, I'm terrible. I'm talking about what I want, not following the script. I'm confident that if there is a will to transform the way we're going to be flowing money, the second point that's going to happen was during the UN General Assembly week on biodiversity. There was a great conversation between financiers about the merits of equity versus debt for green project. I could understand half of it, but it was great to see people with that level of interest in finance engaging into those and following the right instruments. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Basile. So unfortunately, we are rapidly coming to the end of this great discussion. I would love to keep it going. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to, but hopefully we can make some connections with the speakers offline. Just to go around the horn one more time, if you can give us just like 2 or 3 words of what is making you hopeful about the future in the face of these simultaneous crises. Where do you see opportunity in just a couple of words? Maybe Pasquale, we can start with you.
I think I just heard this from Brazil, the financiers, that financial world is increasingly interested. They want to do that. The designers want to do that. The government think and now they need to do that. So I'm very positive this is going to happen. If we can force it through regulations, rules, etc., it will be happening a bit faster. But I'm quite optimistic. We just need to be realistic about it.
Asha.
Yeah, in addition to everything like we've discussed today, like it's great to be able to discuss about things at different scales. I think for me, the one thing that really brings me hope is the fact that there are about 8.7 million species out there who can provide answers to our challenges. You know, if we have a challenge, we can ask them and we can find those answers. And I think it's just endless hope. And I think that keeps me going.
Great, perfect answer. Thank you, Asha. Richard.
Well, I think it'd be, I mean, I'm not going to indulge in any sort of false optimism. I think we're going through a really difficult historic period of urbanisation, and that urbanisation process will continue for the rest of the century at least. However, as we urbanise, eventually the population growth will stabilise. That's one of the factors of urbanisation. And with a stabilised population, let's say in the 22nd century, we will move into a different sort of period. The question is how we get through this immediate bottleneck and what we come out the other end with. And that's why it's so important to set aside, not to lock up and not to enshrine a kind of nature-culture dualism, but all of our landscapes are novel ecosystems. They need to be planned and designed, but we do need to care for those landscapes with a long-term future view so that when the population does settle down and when the economists work out a way of making money without destroying everything, we'll have something left.
Great. Thank you for that very realistic perspective, Richard. Benjamin, a couple of quick words as we close out here.
Thank you very much. Well, I would say I'm optimistic. Even in these difficult times with the pandemic, I just see that we continue to meet online, and not only in this meeting here, but with all our partners, and it even opens up many opportunities now to have meetings across the globe. And I think this exchange plus having different viewpoints, especially when we go back to the Costa Rican case, it is absolutely necessary that many people from different walks of life, scientific backgrounds and institutions sit around the table and discuss the things. And if there's some empathy involved, and that's what I see in all these cases, then I'm quite optimistic that we are going to solve mutual problems at the same time.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, everyone. Basile, I will take your optimism about finance as your final word, if that's okay with you. Okay. Kate, back to you, Kate Newman, to close us out with some final words. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Great work, everyone.
This is a great and inspiring close with almost everybody saying hope and optimism. That's awesome. And in this year of multiple calamities raining on us, it's actually turning out to be the year of deeper thinking, deeper reflection, and every in every sector, and one of them is infrastructure. It's starting this, let's say 10 years ago would have been rather impossible, but as all of you have said, there's interest, there's desire, and I think what we need to be doing as a community is providing information and options and ideas and getting those out into the places where the people are actually making decisions. So this is an attempt for that, to get that rolling. And Ryan, do you want to just briefly say how we're going to keep going on our series here?
Yeah, exactly. So we are over time, so we will close this right now, but just to quickly remind you that we have 2 more events coming up in the next few weeks on October 29th, all about finance, so really continuing in a deeper way that resource mobilization conversation. And then on November 5th, also a deep dive on engineering with nature, following on some of those examples that we saw from Richard on the sand engine in the Netherlands and others. So thank you again, everyone, for more than 100 of you that stuck around for the full 90 minutes. Greatly appreciated. Thanks again to our panelists and the work that you put in. Looking forward to continuing to connect with all of you and continuing this discussion. Thanks so much, everyone. See you on October 29th.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.